Step into the shadows where reality blurs with the supernatural. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Dive into our collection of eerie tales and unravel mysteries that will chill you to the bone. Listen closely. Your next fear might be just a story away. The Whispering Woods. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just a tale of adventure or mystery. It's a stark warning. The events that unfolded in the ancient forest near my hometown transformed my life in ways I never imagined. What began as a peaceful exploration of the wilderness turned into an encounter with the inexplicable, leaving me forever haunted by the darkness that lingers within those trees. This is a real event, but I've added elements to make it even more unsettling, because some things are too terrifying to be fully understood. I've always found solace in the embrace of nature, especially in the deep woods where the world seems to pause, and only the whispers of the wind and the rustle of leaves break the silence. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, I often wandered through the trees, losing myself in the untouched beauty of the wild. To me, the forest was a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the world and find peace in the stillness of nature. But the Whispering Woods was different. I first heard about this ancient forest in passing, from an old man who lived on the outskirts of town. His voice trembled as he spoke of the woods, his eyes clouded with fear. He told me that the forest was alive, not with the usual flora and fauna, but with something darker, something that had been there for centuries, waiting. The stories he shared were chilling. Tales of people who had ventured into the woods and never returned, and those who did were never the same. Their eyes, he said, held a darkness that no light could ever penetrate. Despite his warnings, I was intrigued. The idea of exploring an ancient forest, one shrouded in mystery and legend, was too tempting to resist. I had spent years exploring the forest around my town, and nothing had ever happened to me. I was confident in my abilities and convinced that the stories were just that. Stories. I decided to visit the Whispering Woods the very next day. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out, the sun barely breaking through the clouds as I approached the edge of the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar and comforting smell. But as I stood at the tree line looking into the dense darkness beyond, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It was as if the forest itself was watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. The trees in the Whispering Woods were unlike any I had seen before. They towered high above, their branches intertwined in a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until it felt like I was walking through twilight even though it was still morning. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig underfoot. There were no birds, no animals, nothing but the eerie quiet of the forest. As I ventured further into the woods, I began to notice something strange. The trees seemed to be moving, their trunks shifting slightly as if they were alive. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I watched, the more certain I became that the trees were indeed moving. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A slow, deliberate movement that seemed to be guiding me deeper into the forest. Then came the whispers. They started softly, barely audible, like the sound of wind through the trees. But as I continued to walk, they grew louder, more distinct, until I could hear them clearly. They were not voices in the traditional sense, but rather a series of soft murmurs and sighs that seemed to come from all around me. The whispers were unsettling, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. It was like they were speaking a language that I couldn't comprehend, yet it felt strangely familiar, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and focus on the path ahead, but the whispers persisted, growing louder with each step I took. It was as if the forest was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't make out the message. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching out to touch me as I passed. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more, convinced that I was being watched. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees standing tall and silent as they had for centuries. The path I was following began to narrow, the trees closing in around me, until I was forced to push my way through the dense undergrowth. The further I went, the more difficult it became to navigate. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches that threatened to trip me with every step. But I pressed on, driven by a strange compulsion to see what lay deeper in the forest. After what felt like hours, I came across a clearing bathed in a strange pale light. The sun was still high in the sky, but the light in the clearing was different, almost unnatural. It cast an eerie glow over everything, making the shadows dance in a way that made my skin crawl. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and twisted as if it had been struck by lightning. The tree was ancient, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal arms, and at its base was a small, narrow path that led into the darkness beyond. I knew I shouldn't follow that path. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn back, to leave the forest and never return. But something was drawing me to it, a force stronger than my fear, compelling me to take that first. It was as if the forest itself was pulling me in, refusing to let me leave without seeing what lay at the end of the path. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as if the forest was trying to warn me of what lay ahead. But it was too late to turn back now. I was in too deep, and I had to see it through. The path wound through the trees, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to see where it was leading. The darkness grew thicker, pressing in around me until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The whispers became more urgent, and with them came a sense of dread that settled deep in my bones. I was no longer alone in the forest. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows just ahead. It was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the blackness of the forest. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to make out who or what. But before I could react, the figure disappeared, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, or was there really someone or something in the forest with me? I didn't have time to find out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I had to keep moving. I continued down the path, my heart pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, growing stronger with each step I took. The trees around me seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like claws, as if trying to pull me back into the darkness. The ground beneath my feet was soft and uneven, and I stumbled more than once as I hurried along the path, desperate to find a way out. But the forest had other plans. The path suddenly ended at a steep cliff, the ground dropping away into a deep, dark chasm below. I skidded to a stop, my heart racing as I peered over the edge. The chasm was wide and deep, its bottom lost in the shadows far below. There was no way across, no way forward. I was trapped. Panic set in as I realized there was no escape. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with a cacophony of voices that I couldn't understand. They seemed to be coming from the chasm, rising up from the darkness below, calling to me, urging me to jump. I backed away from the edge, my mind racing with fear. I had to find a way out, but the forest was relentless, closing in around me, leaving me with no way to turn. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with glowing eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into my very soul. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew that whatever it was, it wanted me to jump. I was on the verge of losing my mind, the fear and the whispers overwhelming my senses. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, the trees closing in, the chasm pulling me closer to the edge. And then, just as I was about to give in, a voice broke through the chaos. A clear, strong voice that cut through the whispers like a knife. Don't listen to them. Indeed, the voice was coming from behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. The figure had. The voice echoed around me, clear and resonant, as though someone was standing right behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart racing, but there was nothing, no one. except for that ominous black silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing. It seemed closer now, and an unsettling energy radiated from it, a tangible malevolence that gripped my very soul. A chill ran through my veins, paralyzing my movements and making my breath hitch in my throat. "Do not listen to them," the voice said again, this time louder and nearer. It felt as though the speaker was just beside me, invisible yet undeniable. My eyes darted around, scanning the thick woods for any sign of movement, any hint of who or what might be speaking. The voice acted like a lifeline amidst a sea of terror, breaking through the cacophony of whispers that surrounded me. I took a step back, away from the ominous presence at the clearing's edge, feeling the ground beneath my feet solidify as I retreated. It was as though the trees themselves were backing away, giving me space, releasing their icy grip on my senses. Yet the figure remained unmoving, its eyes, or what I imagined were eyes, locked onto me, following my every move through the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," the voice warned, and I felt a tremor of dread ripple through me. The voice was disembodied, yet filled with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. It felt ancient, as if it had been echoing through these woods for centuries, waiting for someone like me to hear it. My retreat quickened, my footsteps growing more frantic as I retraced my path, desperate to escape the looming threat. The whispers that had been taunting me began to fade, as though the forest itself was yielding to the unseen force that had intervened. Occasionally I caught fleeting glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow passing too quickly to be real, a sensation of being watched that prickled the back of my neck. But each time I turned, there was nothing. The forest seemed to relent its oppressive weight, lifting slightly as I moved further away. But I knew deep down that this reprieve was temporary. The secrets of this forest were ancient, hidden in its very soil, and I had unwittingly stumbled too close to something that was never meant to be uncovered. As I broke through the tree line and into a clearing bathed in the dim light of the setting sun, a wave of relief washed over me. The forest had released its hold on me, but the memory of that dark figure, of the whispers that had filled my mind, would haunt me forever. The encounter had opened a door to something much darker and more mysterious than I could ever imagined. I thought I had escaped, but the forest had left its mark on me. The things I saw, the things I heard, they weren't just tricks of the mind. They were real, and they were just the beginning. As I stood there catching my breath, I knew that the darkness I had encountered in the woods was still with me, lurking just beneath the surface. Weeks passed, but the memories of that day never faded. Night after night I dreamed of the forest, of the shadows that moved within it, and of the voice that had called out to me. In my dreams I found myself back in that clearing, staring once again at the dark figure that seemed to grow closer with each passing night. I tried to forget, to push the memories deep down, but they refused to stay buried. I became consumed with the need to understand what had happened, to uncover the truth behind the forest's mysteries. But every time I ventured close, the fear would grip me once more, and I would find myself retreating, unable to face whatever lay hidden within those ancient trees. The townspeople had their own stories, of course. Legends passed down through generations about the forest and the things that lurked within it, but no one ever spoke of it openly. It was as though they were afraid that even mentioning the forest's name would invite its darkness into their lives. Despite my growing obsession, I couldn't bring myself to return to the forest. Something was holding me back, a deep primal fear that kept me from crossing that threshold again. Yet the more I resisted, the stronger the pull became, as though the forest was calling out to me, drawing me back into its depths. One evening, as I sat by the fire trying to warm the chill that had settled in my bones, I heard it again. The voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It echoed in my mind, filling me with the same dread I had felt that day in the clearing. But this time, there was something different in the voice. An urgency, a desperation that hadn't been there before. "You cannot escape," it whispered, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "It will find you, no matter where you go." Panic surged through me as I realized that the forest had not forgotten me. It was still watching, still waiting for me to return. The shadows in my dreams, the dark figure that haunted my every thought, they were not confined to they had followed me, infiltrated my life, and now they were closing in. I knew then that there was no escaping the forest. It had claimed me, marked me as its own, and there was no going back. The only way to end this nightmare was to return, to face whatever it was that had been awakened within those ancient trees. But I was not ready. Not yet. The fear was still too strong, the memories too vivid. I needed time to prepare, time to steel myself for the inevitable confrontation that I knew was coming. As the days turned into weeks, the voice became more persistent, more insistent. It no longer waited for the night to haunt my dreams. It followed me everywhere, echoing in the quiet moments, whispering in the corners of my mind, driving me closer. The townspeople began to notice the change in me. They could see the fear in my eyes, the way I would start at the slightest sound, the way I avoided the forest at all costs. But they said nothing. Perhaps they understood, or perhaps they were too afraid to ask. And then, one night, I could take it no longer. The voice had grown too loud, too overwhelming to ignore. It consumed my every thought, drowning out everything else until there was nothing left but the need to return, to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of my mind. I packed my things, my hands trembling with fear and anticipation. I didn't know what I would find in the forest, but I knew I had to go. There was no other choice. The forest had called me back, and I could not refuse. As I stepped out into the night, the air was thick with anticipation, as though the very world was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, and the forest loomed ahead, dark and with each step, the fear grew, tightening its grip around my chest until I could barely breathe. But I kept walking, driven by a force that was stronger than the fear, stronger than anything I had ever known. The forest was waiting for me, and I was ready. As I re-entered the whispering woods, the familiar sense of dread that had gripped me weeks ago returned with a vengeance. The forest, though silent under the moonlit sky, seemed to breathe with an anticipation that mirrored my own fear. Each step I took was accompanied by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, sounds that felt unnervingly loud in the otherwise oppressive silence. The path I had taken before was obscured by layers of fallen leaves and new growth. I struggled to remember the way, but the whispers had already begun. They were faint at first, like distant echoes carried on the wind, but as I ventured deeper, they grew louder, more distinct. It was as if the forest itself was alive, calling out to me with voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. I moved cautiously, each step deliberate, trying to push through the fog of fear that clouded my mind. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. The whispers formed a low hum around me, growing in volume as I ventured further into the woods. It was the same haunting melody that had plagued my dreams, only now it was accompanied by an almost tangible presence that seemed to close in around me. The clearing where I had first encountered the ominous figure was just as I remembered, bathed in the unnatural pale light. The massive, blackened tree stood at its center, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, like the path leading away from it was no longer visible. Instead, it was replaced by a thick wall of brambles and undergrowth, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me from moving forward. As I stood at the edge of the clearing, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to form a coherent message, though it was still indecipherable, an ancient language of the forest that I could not understand. The dark figure I had seen before was nowhere to be found, but its presence lingered in the air, a palpable force that seemed to pulse with the whispers. I took a deep breath and forced myself to push through the brambles, driven by a sense of urgency that I could not explain. The forest seemed to resist my efforts, the branches clawing at my clothes and the thorns scratching at my skin, but I pressed on, determined to uncover the truth that lay hidden in the depths of the woods. The path, though obstructed, led me deeper into the forest, and as I moved forward, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath became visible in the cold air, and I could feel the chill seeping through my clothes. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as though the forest itself was alive with voices that were trying to communicate something of grave importance. Suddenly, the path opened up into another clearing, one that was unlike any I had seen before. This one was darker, shrouded in an almost palpable gloom that seemed to cling to the air. At the center of the clearing was a stone altar covered in moss and vine. The altar was old, its surface weathered by centuries of exposure to the elements. Around it were strange symbols etched into the ground, forming a crude circle that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. I approached the altar with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The symbols around it were unfamiliar, but they radiated an aura of ancient power. The whispers grew more frantic as I drew closer, their tones rising in a crescendo that filled my ears. I could feel an overwhelming sense of malevolence emanating from the altar, as though it was a focal point of the forest's dark energy. As I stood before the altar, I noticed something else. A book lying open on the stone surface. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the script written in it was in a language I did not recognize. The text was accompanied by drawings of grotesque creatures and scenes of ritualistic ceremonies that made my skin crawl. I couldn't help but feel that this book was a key to understanding the forest's dark secrets. I reached out to touch the book, but as my fingers brushed its surface, a sudden chill ran through me, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. It was as if the forest was protesting my intrusion, trying to prevent me from discovering what lay hidden within the pages. But the need to understand overpowered my fear, and I carefully turned the pages, trying to decipher the cryptic messages written in the ancient script. The book spoke of a ritual performed by an ancient cult, one that had once inhabited these woods. The ritual was intended to summon a powerful entity from another realm, an entity that was said to grant immense power in exchange for a terrible price. The drawings depicted the ritual in vivid detail, showing the cult members performing dark ceremonies at the altar, their faces twisted in a mixture of fear and ecstasy. As I read, the ground beneath me began to tremble, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. The symbols on the ground around the altar seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, and I could feel the air growing thicker, charged with a dark energy that made my heart race. It was as though the forest was reacting to the knowledge I was uncovering, its ancient power awakening in response to my intrusion. I had barely finished reading the passage when the whispers suddenly ceased, replaced by a profound silence that was almost deafening. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The darkness around the clearing seemed to deepen, and the shadows began to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being altered, and I could sense a presence emerging from the depths of the forest. The figure I had seen before materialized at the edge of the clearing, its form more defined than before. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a distinct shape, a dark silhouette with glowing eyes that bore into me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The figure moved slowly towards the altar, its movements fluid and deliberate, as though it was drawn to the ancient power that radiated from the stone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure approached. The whispers returned, now forming a coherent chant that seemed to be coming from the forest itself. The chant was rhythmic, a low, hypnotic sound that resonated with the beating of my own heart. It was as though the forest was performing its own ritual, summoning something from the shadows. The figure reached the altar and began to move its hands in intricate patterns, as if performing a ritual of its own. The symbols on the ground glowed brighter, their light pulsing in time with the figure's movements. I could feel the air growing heavier, charged with a malevolent energy that seemed to seep into my very soul. I wanted to flee, to escape the dark presence that was enveloping the clearing, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the figure's eyes locked onto mine as though it was drawing strength from my fear. The shadows around the clearing seemed to close in, and I could feel the darkness pressing against me, threatening to consume me, just when I thought I could bear it no longer. The figure's chant reached a climax, and the ground beneath the altar began to tremble violently. The light from the symbols intensified, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy that felt like it was crushing me. A blinding flash of light erupted from the altar, and for a moment, Everything was engulfed in a brilliant, searing glow. When the light subsided, the figure was gone, and the clearing was once again shrouded in darkness. The whispers had ceased, and the air felt lighter, as though the oppressive force had been lifted. I stumbled away from the altar, my mind reeling from the events I had just witnessed. The forest was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze. As I made my way back through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something much larger, something that was beyond my understanding. The forest had shown me its true nature, and the encounter had left a mark on me that would never fade. The darkness I had faced was not just a part of the forest. It was a part of me now, a shadow that would follow me wherever I went. The whispering woods had claimed its price, and as I emerged from the forest, I knew that my life would never be the same. The secrets I had uncovered were only the beginning, and the darkness that had been awakened in those ancient trees would continue to haunt me, a constant reminder of the night when I ventured into the heart of the forest and glimpsed the true face of fear. It's the echoing shadow. When I moved into my new apartment in a quiet, seemingly serene neighborhood, I had no idea that my life would soon be overshadowed by a chilling mystery. The apartment was perfect for a fresh start, nestled in an old brick building that had seen better days but still retained a certain charm. It was a peaceful retreat from the chaos of the city, or so I thought. Little did I know, my new neighbor would draw me into an unsettling enigma that would blur the line between the living and the dead. This is the story of how I discovered that my neighbor might have been dead for a very long time. The day I moved in was bright and clear, the kind of day that makes everything seem new and full of possibilities. My new apartment was on the second floor of a 2-story building that had ivy creeping up its weathered brick walls. The flower boxes beneath the windows were filled with vibrant blooms, adding a touch of color to the otherwise drab surroundings. It was exactly the kind of place I envisioned for a peaceful new chapter in my life. As I unpacked boxes and arranged my belongings, I noticed the peculiar silence that seemed to pervade the building. The occasional murmur of distant voices and the soft rustling of leaves outside were the only sounds that broke the stillness. The quiet was almost too perfect, like a veil that obscured the true nature of the place. My curiosity was immediately piqued by the apartment next door, Unit 3B. It was one of the only units I hadn't seen during my initial visit. The door was a plain wooden affair, slightly scratched and worn, with a brass number plate that read 3B. The building's management had mentioned that the tenant was a reclusive man, but offered no further details. The door seemed to stand as a barrier, hinting at the secrets it might hold. The first time I encountered Mr. Carter was a peculiar experience. I had just finished unpacking and was adjusting a vase on my living room table when I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I was greeted by a figure dressed in an old-fashioned suit, looking like he had stepped out of another era. His clothes were impeccably neat, but they seemed strangely out of place. His face was pale and drawn, with deep-set eyes that seemed to penetrate through me. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter and welcomed me to the building with a distant, almost eerie politeness. Over the next few days, I observed that Mr. Carter's apartment was perpetually dark. The curtains were always drawn, and there were never any signs of life within. The air around his door felt colder than the rest of the building, and an odd, musty smell seemed to seep through the cracks. Despite these peculiarities, I tried to dismiss them as the quirks of an eccentric neighbor. However, my unease grew when I started to notice more disturbing signs. The hallway outside my apartment was dimly lit, with shadows stretching unnaturally long. One evening, as I was returning from a late-night walk, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from Mr. Carter's apartment. When I checked, the door was firmly shut and the hallway was eerily silent. This strange experience was the first indication that something was not quite right. Determined to understand more about Mr. Carter, I began asking other tenants about him. To my surprise, no one seemed to know much about him. Some tenants claimed they had never seen him, while others spoke of him in hushed tones, as if afraid to say too much. The building's management was equally unhelpful, offering only vague and evasive responses. The more I learned, the more the sense of mystery surrounding Mr. Carter deepened. One particularly unsettling night, I was unable to sleep and decided to take a stroll around the building. The hallway was dim, with the only light coming from a flickering overhead bulb. As I walked past Mr. Carter's apartment, I noticed that his door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peered inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, and I could barely make out the outlines of furniture covered in white sheets. The room was coated in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung from the corners. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of people I didn't recognize, all staring blankly at the camera. The silence was oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I quickly retreated, feeling a cold chill settle over me. My growing sense of unease prompted me to investigate further. I found myself drawn to the apartment more frequently, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss. Objects shifting on their own, strange noises at odd hours, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. The atmosphere of the building seemed to be shifting, becoming more charged with an inexplicable energy. One evening, I encountered a young woman standing outside Mr. Carter's apartment. She was dressed in vintage clothing, her attire out of place with the modern world. She was staring intently at the door, her face etched with sorrow. As I approached, she turned to look at me with eyes that seemed to reflect a deep sadness. Before I could speak, she vanished into the night, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of dread. The turning point came one night when I decided to confront Mr. Carter directly. I knocked on his door, hoping to have a conversation and perhaps learn more about his odd behavior. When he answered, his presence was even more unsettling than before. He seemed paler than usual, his eyes hollow and distant. His voice was barely more than a whisper, as he warned me to stay away from his apartment and to leave the building as soon as possible. His words were laced with a sense of urgency and menace that left me feeling deeply unsettled. Unable to ignore the mystery any longer, I resolved to uncover the truth. I delved into the building's history, researching old records and newspaper articles. What I discovered only added to the intrigue. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s, and several tenants over the years had reported strange occurrences. The most disturbing revelations were about Mr. Carter himself. His name appeared in articles connected to mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. Despite my growing fear, I was unable to leave the building. The allure of the mystery and the strange connection I felt to the apartment kept me there. Objects moving on their own, settling phenomena, peculiar sounds at night, and an ever-present sensation of being observed. The building seemed to be alive with secrets, and I was drawn deeper into its web. Despite my growing fear, I was unable to leave the building. The allure of the mystery and the strange connection I felt to the apartment kept me there. Objects moving on their own, peculiar sounds at night, and an ever-present sensation of being observed. The building seemed to be alive with secrets, and I was drawn deeper into its web. As the days passed, the disturbances became more frequent and intense. One evening, as I sat reading in the dim light of my living room, a cold draft swept through the apartment. The window was tightly shut, yet the temperature dropped suddenly, causing a chill to run down my spine. The draft carried with it a faint, sorrowful whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the old pipes and creaky floorboards, but the eerie feeling lingered. I decided to investigate further. The building's layout was simple, with only a handful of apartments, and I was curious about the history of my enigmatic neighbor. I began asking around, hoping to glean some information from the other residents. Most were reserved, offering little more than polite nods or vague responses when I inquired about the occupant of the apartment next door. One elderly woman, Mrs. Dunbar, was the exception. She seemed to know more than she let on. Mrs. Dunbar lived on the floor below mine. Her apartment was filled with antique furniture and knickknacks that seemed to tell stories of a bygone era. I had always found her to be a bit peculiar, with her sharp eyes and way of speaking as if she had just stepped out of a time capsule. One afternoon, I decided to approach her with my growing concerns. "Mrs. Dunbar," I began, trying to sound casual. I was wondering if you could tell me more about the history of the building. I've noticed some odd things happening lately." Her eyes narrowed, and she studied me for a moment before responding. "Ah, the old building," she said, her voice low and almost reverent. "It's seen a lot of lives come and go, let me tell you." I pressed on, hoping to glean something useful. "What about the apartment next door? The one with the mysterious occupant?" Her expression changed subtly, her gaze growing distant. "That apartment has had many tenants over the years," she said slowly. "Not all of them stayed long, and some didn't leave at all." I felt a shiver run down my spine at her cryptic words. "What do you mean by that?"
Mrs. Dunbar's face grew somber, and she seemed to hesitate before speaking. "There's been talk about that apartment for years. Some say it's cursed, others that it's haunted. It's not a place many people like to discuss."
Her words only fueled my curiosity and unease. I thanked her and returned to my apartment, feeling a mix of dread and anticipation. That night, I decided to keep a closer watch on the strange occurrences. I placed a small tape recorder on the bookshelf in the living room to capture any unusual sounds while I slept. The next morning, I played back the recording, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Soft, disembodied whispers filled the audio, along with the distinct sound of footsteps that seemed to move around the apartment. Despite my having been alone, there were no windows open, no drafts, no logical explanation for the noises I had captured. As weeks went by, the activity in my apartment escalated. Objects started disappearing and reappearing in different places, and at night, I would hear the unsettling sound of scratching at the door. One particularly disturbing incident occurred when I was woken in the middle of the night by a heavy, oppressive silence. I looked around, feeling as though I were being watched, and noticed that the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen presence. Unable to tolerate the growing unease, I decided to confront the neighbor directly. I approached the apartment next door and knocked on the door, but there was no response. I waited for several minutes, the silence stretching on before I finally gave up and returned to my own apartment. That night, I dreamt of the apartment next door. In the dream, I was inside the dark, cluttered space, and I could feel a palpable sense of despair. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air was thick with a sense of loss. I woke up sweating and disoriented, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, to uncover the truth, I went to the local library to research the history of the building. I pored over old newspapers and city records, searching for any mention of the apartment or its previous occupants. It was there that I discovered a chilling detail. The apartment next door had once belonged to a man named Richard Forsythe, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances several decades ago. According to the records, Richard Forsythe had been a reclusive figure, rarely seen outside his apartment. Neighbors reported strange noises and unsettling occurrences, but no one had ever been able to explain them. Forsythe's disappearance was never solved, and the case was eventually closed as a cold case. Armed with this new information, I returned to my apartment with a growing sense of dread. The knowledge that my neighbor might be connected to a long unsolved mystery only heightened my anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that Forsythe's presence still lingered in the building, and that his story was intertwined with my own. One night, I decided to take a chance and investigate the apartment next door more thoroughly. I brought a flashlight and a camera, hoping to find some clues that might explain the strange occurrences. I picked the lock on the door using a spare key I had found in the maintenance room and pushed it open with a creak, dark, cluttered, and frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture sat in disarray and the air was thick with the scent of neglect. I moved cautiously through the rooms, taking photographs and noting any unusual details. In the bedroom, I found a large, ornate mirror covered with a draped cloth. With trembling hands, I pulled the cloth away, revealing the mirror's reflective surface. For a moment, I stared at my own reflection, the dim light casting eerie shadows across my face. Then I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror seemed to move independently of my own actions. It was as though another figure stood behind me, its features obscured and shifting. My heart raced, and I quickly turned around, but the room was empty. I glanced back at the mirror and saw that the reflection had returned to normal. I took several more photos, trying to capture the strange phenomena, but the mirror's surface remained still and unremarkable. Feeling a mix of frustration and fear, I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to exit the apartment, I heard a faint whisper behind me. It was a voice I recognized from the recordings. Soft, mournful, and barely audible. I spun around, but there was no one there. The apartment was silent more. I hurried back to my own apartment, my mind racing with questions and theories. The mirror, the whispers, and the eerie reflections. Everything seemed to point to a lingering presence in the building. I couldn't escape the feeling that Richard Forsyth's spirit was trying to communicate with me, and that the apartment held the key to unraveling the mystery. In the days that followed, I found myself growing increasingly obsessed with the apartment and its secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and the strange occurrences continued unabated. I would often hear the disembodied whispers at night and find objects move from their original places. It was as though the apartment next door was a portal to a world beyond, a world where the past and present collided in a haunting dance. One evening, I decided to revisit Mrs. Dunbar and ask her more about Richard Forsyth. I hoped that she might have some additional information or insight into the mysterious events. When I arrived at her apartment, she greeted me with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting me. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "You've been delving into things best left undisturbed." I pressed her for more details, but she remained cryptic. "Some things are better left to the shadows," she said, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and sympathy. Despite her warnings, I couldn't let go of the mystery. The apartment, the whispers, and the reflections were all part of a larger puzzle that I was determined to solve. I continued to explore the building and its secrets, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a growing sense of dread. In the end, I could only speculate about the true nature of the apartment and its haunting presence. Was Richard Forsyth's spirit trapped within the walls, forever bound to the place where he had disappeared? Or was there something more sinister at play, something that defied explanation? The apartment next door remained a dark and enigmatic presence, its secrets locked away from the world. As I lay in bed each night, I could feel the weight of the building's history pressing down on me, and the whispers of the past continued to echo through the corridors. The line between the living and the dead had become blurred, and I was left to navigate the shadows of a mystery that might never be fully understood. The eerie feeling of being watched never truly dissipated, and the strange occurrences became a part of my everyday life. The apartment next door remained a constant reminder of the unknown, a place where the echoes of the past continued to resonate with a haunting clarity, and as I drifted off to sleep each night, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets lay hidden behind the walls of the old building, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The cursed letter. It all began one seemingly ordinary Tuesday. My name is John Winters, and I'm a 38-year-old office worker living alone in a modest apartment in the city. My life had always been routine and uneventful until the day I received a letter that would change everything. The letter was ordinary in appearance, but possessed an undeniable aura of malevolence. After reading its cryptic contents, I found myself plunged into a series of disturbing and inexplicable events that defied all rational explanation. This is the story of how a single piece of correspondence unraveled my life and dragged me into a nightmare from which I could not awaken. The letter arrived in the mail on a dreary, rain-soaked Monday afternoon. I remember the exact moment I pulled it from my mailbox, the damp envelope feeling unusually cold against my fingers. The address was handwritten in an elegant script, but there was no return address. I slipped the envelope into my bag, dismissing it as just another piece of junk mail. Little did I know, this letter would be the beginning of my descent into a world of terror. That evening, after a long day at work, I settled into my apartment with a cup of tea. I was alone, as usual, and relished the quietude of my small living space. The letter sat on the kitchen counter, its presence oddly unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open it. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. The message was typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, and it read, "Those to whom it may concern. You do not know me, but I have been watching you. You are about to embark on a journey into the unknown. Your world will soon be turned upside down, and the only way to escape the darkness is to uncover the truth hidden within these words. Beware the shadows that move when you are not looking, for they are more than mere tricks of the light. You have been warned. The letter ended abruptly, with no signature or date. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the last line. The message seemed nonsensical, but the foreboding tone lingered in my mind. I dismissed it as a prank or an elaborate joke, not realizing how profoundly it would affect my life. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a series of faint noises, soft scratching sounds coming from the walls. I brushed them off as the creaks of an old building settling. Yet, the scratching grew louder and more insistent. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention from within the very walls of my apartment. Sleep eluded me, and I lay awake in the dark, my imagination running wild. The shadows in my room seemed to shift and flicker, creating eerie shapes on the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of the night. The following days were marked by an escalating series of strange occurrences. Objects in my apartment began to move on their own. My coffee mug would inexplicably shift positions on the kitchen counter, and my books would fall off the shelves with no apparent cause. I chalked these incidents up to stress or a trick of my tired mind, but they were unnervingly consistent. One evening, as I was reading in the living room, I noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the air, and an inexplicable chill settled over me. I glanced at the window, expecting to see frost or condensation, but there was nothing. It was as though an invisible force was sapping the warmth from the room. Thursday that night, the scratching sounds returned, but this time they were accompanied by something else, a soft, mournful whispering. I could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, desperate. I tried to locate the source of the noise, but found nothing. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My attempts to find logical explanations for these events were fruitless. I consulted with my neighbors, who all assured me that they had not experienced anything unusual. I even had a professional pest control service inspect the apartment for any signs of infestations were negative, and I was left with nothing but my growing sense of dread. Then, the true horror began. I started receiving strange phone calls in the middle of the night. The caller never spoke, but the line was always open, and I could hear heavy breathing and faint, eerie music playing in the background. I tried to trace the calls, but they always came from untraceable numbers. One particularly frightening night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash coming from the kitchen. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding, and found that the kitchen door was ajar. Inside, the refrigerator had been emptied of its contents, and everything inside was scattered across the floor. I searched the apartment, but there was no sign of an intruder. Desperation led me to research the history of my apartment building, hoping to find some clue that would explain the disturbances. I discovered that the building had once been home to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances several decades ago. According to old newspaper articles, she had received a series of threatening letters before her disappearance, similar to the one I had received. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth about Eleanor Blackwood. My research revealed that she had been a recluse, known for her strange behavior and rumored involvement in occult practices. Her disappearance remained unsolved, and there were whispers of a curse associated with her name. As I delved deeper into the mystery, the disturbances in my apartment grew more intense. I began to experience vivid nightmares, where I would find myself wandering through dark, twisted hallways, always followed by a shadowy figure. The sense of being watched was constant, and I could not escape the feeling of impending doom. One night, in a state of utter exhaustion, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of grim determination, I explored the darkest corners of my apartment. My search led me to the attic, a place I'd never previously ventured. The attic was filled with old, dusty furniture and forgotten belongings. As I shone the flashlight around the attic, I stumbled upon a small, hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, I found a collection of old letters and photographs, all related to Eleanor Blackwood. Among the items was a final letter addressed to me. It was a chilling confession from Eleanor herself, detailing her involvement in dark rituals and her fear of retribution. The letter revealed that she had been trying to warn others about a malevolent force she had unleashed. Her final message was a desperate plea for someone to end the cycle of torment that had begun with her. I realized that the curse had been passed on to me through the letter I had received, and the only way to break it was to confront the entity that had been haunting me. And as the weight of the realization sank heavily into my chest, I knew I could not escape the curse simply by leaving the apartment or ignoring the malevolent presence. The entity had marked me, and I was bound to this ordeal until it was resolved. My nights were plagued with relentless terror, my days consumed by the need to understand and confront the dark force that had taken hold of my life. I had to face the entity head-on, but I had no idea where to start or how to proceed. In the following days, I researched various methods to confront supernatural entities, delving into occult literature, historical accounts of hauntings, and testimonials from those who had faced similar threats. I discovered that the most effective approach to banish malevolent spirits often involved a combination of rituals, symbols, and a deep understanding of the entity's nature. I sought out experts in the field, hoping their knowledge could guide me through this harrowing ordeal. I contacted a local paranormal investigator, Dr. Lydia Sterling, who had a reputation for dealing with particularly challenging hauntings. She agreed to meet with me, intrigued by the nature of my case. Her office was filled with old tomes, artifacts, and peculiar trinkets collected from her numerous investigations. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and old parchment, a testament to the many mysteries she had unraveled. Dr. Sterling listened intently as I recounted my experiences, showing her the cursed letter and describing the events that had transpired. Her face grew somber as she read Eleanor Blackwood's final message, and she nodded knowingly. "This is indeed troubling," Dr. Sterling said, her voice steady but filled with concern. Eleanor Blackwood was known in the paranormal community. Her case has been studied extensively, and her story has always been one of tragedy and darkness. The curse she spoke of is said to be a powerful and malevolent entity that feeds on fear and despair. She explained that the entity was a spirit of immense power, capable of causing chaos and fear in the lives of those it targeted. It thrived on negative emotions and was often associated with dark rituals and forbidden knowledge. And to confront and banish such an entity required not only a thorough understanding of its nature, but also the courage to face one's deepest fears. Dr. Sterling suggested a series of steps to confront the entity. The first step was to gather protective items and symbols. We compiled a list that included salt, holy water, protective symbols, and herbs known for their purifying properties. We also needed to perform a series of rituals designed to weaken the entity's hold and drive it away. As the days turned into weeks, I worked tirelessly to prepare for the confrontation. My apartment became a makeshift preparation area, cluttered with candles, incense, and various protective items. Sterling visited regularly, guiding me through the rituals and helping me set up the protective barriers around my apartment. Each visit seemed to heighten the tension, and the atmosphere in the apartment grew increasingly oppressive. One evening, as we prepared for the final ritual, a sense of dread hung heavily in the air. Dr. Sterling and I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by candles arranged in a protective circle. The symbols and runes we had drawn on the floor seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that danced ominously on the walls. Dr. Sterling began chanting in an ancient language, her voice steady and commanding. I followed her lead, repeating the words as best as I could. The atmosphere grew thicker and the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath fogged up in the cold air, and I could see my heart pounding visibly through my chest. As the ritual progressed, strange phenomena began to occur. The candles flickered erratically, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The whispers I had heard before grew louder, converging into a chorus of disembodied voices that echoed through the room. It was as if the very walls were alive with the malevolent presence. Suddenly, A loud crash came from the kitchen, followed by a piercing wail that seemed to come from deep within the apartment. I turned to Dr. Sterling, who remained focused on the ritual, her eyes closed and her hands raised in concentration. I could feel a malevolent force pressing down on me, making it difficult to breathe and causing my vision to blur. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and I could see my breath crystallizing in the freezing air. The shadows on the walls seemed to converge into a dark, swirling mass, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid form. It was the entity, manifesting in its full, terrifying presence. Its eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and its form was shrouded in a swirling mist of darkness. The entity's gaze was fixed on me, and I felt a profound sense of dread wash over me. My heart raced, and I struggled to maintain my composure. Dr. Sterling's chanting grew more intense, her voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and wails that filled the room. The protective symbols on the floor began to glow with a faint, eerie light, creating a barrier between us and the entity. As the ritual reached its climax, the entity's form began to waver and distort. It let out a chilling, otherworldly scream that reverberated through the apartment, causing the walls to tremble. The protective circle we had created seemed to pulse with energy, pushing back against the malevolent force. Dr. Sterling's voice reached a fever pitch, and with one final powerful chant, she directed a stream of holy water toward the entity. The water sizzled and evaporated upon contact, and the entity recoiled, its form beginning to dissipate. The whispers and wails grew fainter, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. The entity let out one last, anguished cry before vanishing completely, leaving the room in an eerie silence. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and the oppressive weight that had settled over the apartment began to lift. Dr. Sterling and I stood in the center of the living room, exhausted but relieved. The ritual had succeeded, and the entity had been banished. In the days that followed, the disturbances in my apartment ceased. The shadows no longer moved on their own, and the cold spots and strange noises disappeared. The oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the apartment for so long was gone, and I felt a profound sense of relief and closure. Despite the resolution of the haunting, I remained haunted by the experience. The cursed letter and the malevolent entity had left an indelible mark on my life. I moved out of the apartment shortly after the ritual, unable to shake the memories of the terror I had endured. The cursed letter was carefully stored away, a chilling reminder of the dark forces that exist beyond our understanding. I often wonder if there are other letters out there waiting to ensnare their next victim. The mystery of Eleanor Blackwood and the curse that followed me will forever remain a part of my life, a dark chapter that I can never fully escape. As I reflect on the ordeal, I am left with a deep sense of respect for the unknown and a newfound appreciation for the fragile boundary between our world and the supernatural. The experience has taught me that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some forces are best left undisturbed.